Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that those words rang a bell, tiny, precise, impossible to ignore. In the world inside and just outside the immaculate fences of Fairmont Crest, promises were currency, and favors were debts with flesh and blood and consequences. Martin Richardson had always understood that. He had learned early on that public life was built on a foundation of small compromises, that every handshake could become a sentence if the person on the other side knew how to read the book of life. Tonight, the book had been rewritten in indelible ink. It begins with a negotiation that could have been called by many names. For Joey Armstrong it was an exchange of risk for control, a professional transaction that smelled of perfume and machine oil, the low, glossy hum of gamblers and the colder, higher hum of men who practice harm like a business. For Martin, who had spent a life cultivated for eloquent deflection and plausible deniability, it was a last-minute salvage operation to save a human being. For Kat Richardson it was the sting of being told she had no leverage where leverage mattered most. For Chelsea Hamilton it was a near death that her young face still could not quite remember. For Allison, it was a closing in panic, the kind a predator feels when its prey slips from the snare. And for Vanessa McBride the aftertaste was the bitter knowledge that she had been used, that her company had become a channel, a polite pipe, for money that should never have borne her name. The deal was simple on paper and monstrous in practice. Martin would go to Joey and barter not cash, not votes, not favors that belonged to his office but something more intangible, a scent. Joey wanted the veneer of legality, the small seal of approval that could turn dirty funds into legitimate business. He wanted a signature, a nod on a set of documents that would allow him to run his money through Vanessa's real estate holdings and walk it out the other side wearing the costume of legitimacy. For Joey, that signature would be the salt that cured the meat. For Martin, it was a trap that might, if he was reckless or brave enough, save Chelsea. Kat arrived at Joey's office first because she had no illusions about patience. She had tried the better channels, police reports, whispered calls to family friends, the soft-voiced pleading that worked when one had proof and resources and the luxury of time. Her evidence had been messy, fingerprinted in panic and blood, and her options narrowed with every hour. Joey, she knew, kept information in databases that were not for the public, the names of people with unstable marriages, the movements of men who kept late hours, the details of who had taken what from whom. If Craig, the man Kat believed Allison claimed as husband, the man who might explain motive and movement, existed with any useful detail, Joey had it. He didn't give Craig. He didn't promise it. Instead he offered a smirk and a rumor. Allison was not an asset to him. Profitable, yes, in the blackmail sense, but not profitable in the way she was suggesting. Joey watched Kat with a predator's small, amused focus and said that Allison would not be useful if the return was Craig. He made it clear that he would not personally profit from her, which was both the lie and the truth in the strangest sense. Joey's profit rarely came from a single person, it came from systems, from channels he controlled. Yet in refusing Craig he pointed, indirectly and with that particular cruel hint of amusement only sociopaths perfect at public theater employ, to Martin. If it's Martin, Joey said, leaning back in leather the color of a cheap coffin, then I might be willing to help. The words hit Kat like a blow you feel in your jaw a beat before you see the fist. Martin. The name had weight. Martin was a kind of currency she had thought untouchable, a rising politician with a public brand of decency and a private ledger and a past that masqueraded as prudence. He was the sort of man who could, with a single note or a single nod, make a crooked building project appear virtuous or let a noisy scandal slide into quiet. He was also, Joey implied with the smallest of smiles, a man in debt. The balance Joey kept in mind was not solely financial, it was reputational, familial, existential. The man who occupied Martin's life had played cards with him before. Joey had a record of waiting, of making small kindnesses that later compounded into obligations. Kat stormed out, anger a bright, hot thing in her chest that she tried to shove into the practical channels of action. She had no choice, she told herself. She was not a person who traded in long-term plans. She moved in moments. So she went to Martin. Martin felt the gravity of Joey's name the moment it was spoken. He had felt that gravity twice now, and both times the earth around him had shifted. He had borrowed once in a way that almost always finds you, a loan of reputation. Joey had made an introduction early in Martin's rise. An introduction that warmed the campaign with cash that bore little scrutiny. That cash bought Martin breathing room when he had needed it. The second debt was more insidious, a favor called in when a man whose face one recognizes from photographs needs something that cannot be tagged in financial statements. Joey had done him favors that were smiles and dinner invitations and a loaned car, nothing that any audit could trace but everything a life remembers as obligation. So when Kat stood in Martin's kitchen under the solvent hum of recessed lighting and told him what she had been told, the exchange, the hint, the almost suggested threat, he listened and felt a coldness take hold where his decisions usually lived warm. He had sworn, in many ways, to a different moral economy. He had sworn to constituents and to the image of himself that he had cultivated. He had sworn, with less public ceremony, to maintain a life that could withstand the inevitable pressure of politics. But he had never imagined being asked to sign away innocence to purchase salvation. The scene of the rescue should have been cinematic. It had the skeleton of one, the tired motel with its slice of neon reflecting in a grease-splattered puddle, the abandoned warehouse with its half-closed roll-up door exposing the mouth of a dim interior. But soap operas and live rescues seldom obey cinematic neatness. They obey contingency and luck, and most of all, they obey the human smallness of error. Martin, riding in a borrowed car with Joey, because Joey insisted on accompanying him, he missed nothing and trusted no one, felt the world reduced to specific and brutal details, the smell of cigarette smoke, the thump of his heart, the way Joey's knuckles pressed white against the steering wheel. Allison was there, a figure of frantic determination with a hand on a knife that looked too small for the force of her intent. Chelsea, bound and pale, sat slumped in a chair, her hair in a tangle that showed where a struggle had been. Time ran like syrup. The moment Martin saw Chelsea, it was as if the social architecture of his life, the speeches, the handshakes, the fundraising luncheon slotted into a new frame. He had seen photographs of suffering and read-typed reports of it. He had not anticipated how physical a person's relief could be, how the eyes can unclench when a door opens and daylight finds you. In the breath between the end of a plan and the beginning of an action, Martin moved. Whether he moved because bravery or because guilt is a discussion for later. In the room, he was the hand that unfastened the ropes and the voice that said, with a steadiness that surprised him, "You're safe now." Allison lunged. She was fast but not fast enough. Vanessa's name, the name of a woman who thought her trust had been honored, had according to Joey already been turned into a ledger that ran a crooked margin. Chelsea's rescue changed nothing about the debt Martin owed. It exacerbated it. Joey had never planned to be charitable. He had planned to make a trade. Martin had thought, briefly and foolishly, that with Chelsea safe he had purchased time. Joey's guns, metaphor and otherwise, were not recharged by pockets of compassion. They were recharged by signatures and the smell of consent. In the wake of Chelsea's rescue, the theater of confrontation opened wider. Vanessa found out, as Vanessa always does through a phone call she had not expected, a ledger in an email, a meeting request in the window of her calendar that carried a subject line her heart understood the way a bell understands the strike. She was a real estate woman who kept ledgers like small confessions, property values, lease terms, purchase agreements. She was not a money launderer, not by vocation or intent. She had allowed her firm to be a conduit, persuaded by promises from Joey about legitimate investment, about helping the community, about payrolls and renovation projects that would revitalize neighborhoods. He had spoken, as he always did, in the language of civic pride. Vanessa had believed in civic pride the way an honest person believes the world will reward honesty. She learned that the money in her firm's account, deposits made in the dead hours, transfers that came from companies with names designed to sound respectable, had origins that made her stomach twist. Joey had used her firm to funnel cash from sources that seemed to exist only on lists and whispers. He had instructed certain payments for rehabilitation projects that never happened, loans that were never repaid on paper because the repayment was tracked in other currencies, in influence, in reputation, in signed documents. Vanessa called him. He was amused. He called her used, in the most literal sense of the word, and then smiled as one would at the discovery of a broken tool. "You were never the asset," Joey told her over dinner. Their dinners had become ritual, a place where he could rehearse humiliation in polite company. "You were a vessel. You understand vessels, don't you? They get used, they get washed, they get shelved." Vanessa hated him for it in a way that was sharper than mere betrayal. She hated herself for the blindness that had allowed it. She had been the kind of woman who measured trust in ink and signatures, the kind who thought the same paper that recorded a purchase could also save her. Now the paper was evidence, and the evidence could be used to lean on someone else. "This is where you come in," Joey said to Martin a week after Chelsea's rescue, in the private room behind the casino's brass and glass facade where the wallpaper was chosen to be simultaneously opulent and forgettable. He laid a stack of documents on a mahogany table and watched Martin read like a man reading the terms of his own indictment. The documents were boring on the face of them: transfer forms, corporate affidavits, zoning release requests. But they were the kind of bureaucracy Joey had always loved, small things that big institutions accepted without looking because the signature line makes everything look legitimate. "You sign these," Joey said, "and Vanessa's company can write one of these loans off, pay down an audit, let the numbers look clean. It's a public record. People will think it's legitimate." He tapped the paper with a fingertip that glittered with expensive rings. "You stamp your name and the county clerk will see it. The banks will see it. The auditors will close one eye. You help me reframe where the money looks like it came from, and you keep Chelsea and Vanessa from being ruined in media cycles the way you need to keep them." Martin's mind, trained to parse policy briefs and campaign speeches and the slow arithmetic of legislative compromise, misfired in the face of the ethical arithmetic Joey expected him to perform. The math was unclean. If he signed, he would be complicit in laundering. If he refused, Joey would be angry, and Joey's anger weighs heavy. He could lose more than career. He could lose the fragile trust that Chelsea now had in the world, a trust she had only just reclaimed breath by breath. He could lose the public life he had built on the illusion of decency. He could walk into a sting so measured and quiet that no one would notice until the cameras did. The room smelled like cigar smoke and responsibility. Joey did not threaten with explicit violence. That is not his style. He preferred to pivot around a person's reputation like a shark circling warm water. Instead he offered precision. "Sign, help me clean it. We carry on. You avoid a scandal you don't need. Vanessa keeps her firm. We pretend nobody mismanaged funds. You keep your family safe. You keep your vote base. And Chelsea, my man, will keep her safe as she recovers." When Martin asked if Chelsea's safety was the literal currency of the deal, Joey answered in the way predators most like, with a fact that was both truth and leverage. "You owe me twice. This is how we settle accounts." Martin's memory stitched together the past favors that led him here: the second mortgage when his campaign had been strapped, the donation that came with a handshake and a smile, the promise to put his name to a zoning approval that would allow Joey to break ground on the lakefront project he had been fantasizing about for years. Each memory was a small thread, harmless enough except for the way strings tangle once you start to tug. The signature Joey wanted was not a one-off, it was a pivot, a hinge that could swing open doors Martin had always kept shut. He tried legislation as a shield. "If this is illegal, I can't be part of that," he said, and meant it. He also meant the things that live behind public statements: a family who counted on him, a grandfather who still believed in letters on paper, a son who had his own messy life. Joey smiled. "Legality is a matter of frame, Martin. You are good at frames." There were people in Martin's orbit who tried to help him think through the day's arithmetic as if it were a spreadsheet: legal counsel who advised in the terms of law and precedent, friends who offered emotional distance as their gift, constituents who expected clarity. But Joey's power was not only an influence upon a single man, it was a gravity that affected whole constellations. Vanessa's company being compromised threatened to pull through reputations of anyone connected. Martin could sign and be complicit, he could refuse and see a cascade of exposures, or he could try to thread the needle and perform some alchemy where truth and subterfuge met and briefly sympathized. Kat's anger was a different currency. She kept thinking of Craig, of the way Joey had laughed him off, of how information is commodified. She could have pressed harder, filed a lawsuit, hired an investigator, made the matter public, but she feared that publicity would be worse for Chelsea. If Allison was unbalanced enough to kill someone who knew too much, then publicity might push her toward frenzy. Private action, ugly as it was, promised immediacy. Martin promised immediacy. The trade, in the logic of a city where every handshake can be a sentence, seemed inevitable. Joey's treatment of Vanessa was instructive. He had used her not as a partner but as a proper legitimate figurehead who could be made useful and then discarded. But he takes scant pleasure in mere cruelty. He takes pleasure in the architecture of power. He wanted a senator to sign a set of seemingly dull documents that somehow held the algebra of his empire in plain ink. The signature would not only launder funds, it would give him a kind of civic imprimatur. He would not be a shadow anymore. He would be a name that could be spoken loudly in the room where civic projects are decided, a man who gives back, who invests, who brings jobs. And then the dirty corners of his operation: loans, under-the-table bribes, bailouts would be able to walk under the same lights. Martin sat at the table and watched Joey's mouth shape sentences with the economy of a man who had always been a step ahead. There was no theatrical knife or explicit physical threat. There was, instead, the slow, methodical demonstration of how systems can be bent into a kind of righteousness if you have the right signatures. He thought of Chelsea's face when she breathed the first clean breaths after being freed. He thought of Vanessa, who had believed in legitimate business and was now watching her name be made a laundromat for other men's corruption. He thought of his grandfather, and his son, and the lines he had sworn not to cross. There was a moment, ridiculous and quiet, when Martin tried to imagine a way out. He thought about going to the press with what he knew, about turning Joey's deals into headlines and making the law take the overpass of public scrutiny. But Joey was too careful for that. He had friends in places with long memories. He did not simply bribe and launder, he owned the eyes that watched, the men who could make inconvenient cameras find their batteries mysteriously dead. If Martin believed public exposure would help, he was naive. If Martin believed compliance would keep his hands clean, that was arrogance. Martin felt like a man at a fork where both roads have traps. He had always been proud of his ability to choose a path that looked moral on both sides, of his talent for the split-second compromise. Tonight, that talent felt like cowardice disguised as prudence. The long conversation with Joey before the signing was not a negotiation so much as a lesson. Joey enumerated ways Martin might be compensated beyond the immediate protection of Chelsea: appointments to boards, political endorsements laundered as philanthropy, a future that would look clean on paper and comfortable in tax filings. "I don't want to be your enemy, Martin," Joey said. "I want to be your partner." Partners solve problems. The real problem was that Joey defined partnership in a way that swallowed his partners whole. The men who had been partners to Joey in the past had been careful to keep their hands clean. They had found that once you accept Joey into the rooms that matter, he does not so much drag you down as rewrite the floor plan. He makes the stairs lead to basements you never meant to visit. As the night unspooled, Martin thought of all the people whose lives would be affected by the path he took: Chelsea, who had been rescued and who would need care and patience and the kind of privacy that is always expensive; Vanessa, whose firm could survive or ruin depending on the slant of a headline; Kat, who had come to him with a fury that was both pure and tactical; Allison, who had to be stopped but also understood, in the strange currency of desperation, why she might have done what she did; and Joey, who saw all of them like a gardener sees plants ready to be pruned. The tension that built did not resolve with a gunshot or a televised confession. It resolved into a kind of quiet that was worse: the silence that fills a room when the line on a contract waits for your signature. Martin sat with a pen in his hand and felt it sway like the chill of a verdict. Around him, Joey's casino breathed, the soft clack of chips, the indifferent laughter of strangers, the music that spooled like white noise. Martin's world was suddenly a single, heavy line. He thought about how easy it would be to sign and be finished with the noise. He thought about how impossible it would be to undo the signature once it had perforated the public record. He thought of Chelsea's eyes, not a plea, not a terror, but a fragile gratitude that asked nothing of his political life and everything of his human one. He thought of Vanessa's hands, the way she had always folded things carefully and trusted schedules. He thought of Kat's anger, which was the only honest thing in the room. Joey's smile did not fade. He placed the documents in front of Martin like an offering or a guillotine. "Sign here," he said. "Sign here. This is all we need." The pen was offered like a torch. The men who stood in the room watched, not for theatrical effect but for the inevitable, the choice and its consequence. In the end, choices are rarely dramatic, they are often small acts dressed as paperwork. Martin's fingers hovered. He could still feel the memory of an early campaign promise, the image of himself speaking of integrity and the need to protect the vulnerable. He could still feel the echo of every small compromise he had made that led to this particular doorway. He could still imagine the undone life, the one he might salvage if he refused. Outside, Fairmont Grass breathed the same clean air fantasy it always sold to the world, lawns trimmed like rehearsed applause, billboards promising progress and civic warmth. Inside, the casino's light made faces look younger and more ruthless. Martin's signature would place him on a map of choices. To sign was to walk into a system with him as an implicated agent. To refuse was to risk everything the men who willed power could turn against him. The choice did not resolve here. It could not. The scene breaks, not with catharsis, but with the kind of pause that promises more, with the promise that the story will continue in the quiet places where signatures become facts and facts become the kind of truth that eats reputations. The signature line, small and pale on the paper, waited beneath Martin's pen like a trapdoor. He inhaled. The pen trembled. Outside, the city lights pulsed, and someone somewhere began to shout, a long way off, into a night that did not feel as forgiving as a politician's memory.